Hello, everybody. This is Keith Caldwell with Our Special Needs Children. I have a special presentation today with attorneys Peter Alfert and Todd Boley. I'd like you guys just to introduce yourselves, tell us a little about who you are and what you guys are doing.
Okay. Hi, Keith. This is Peter Alfert. I'm an attorney in Walnut Creek. Our law firm is Hinton, Alfert, and Kahn. Several years ago, we got a case involving a special needs child that was abused in a school setting. And we got together with Todd Boley, whose offices are in Oakland, to prosecute that case. And that was a real eye-opener for both of us, because once we started litigating that case, we found that the problems relating to abuse of special education children in our school system was a really serious problem and was not being adequately addressed by school systems or the law. And from that one case that we handled, it has now become the major focus of, I think, my practice, certainly, and I believe Todd's as well. Todd, what do you think?
Sorry, I was distracted because somebody came in to tell me a message. But I've been practicing in the area of civil rights for about 30 years. A lot of it has been representing a wide variety of governmental agencies, but also, going back, I worked on special education cases with the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii back in the 70s, and so I have some familiarity with the issues and how to translate these claims into an action you can bring as a civil rights case. And what I think I found, and one last piece, was that I also represented the Department of Developmental Services for a number of years in cases involving their state hospitals. And what was really interesting to me was how the complaints that were made against state hospitals involving people with developmental disabilities was being replicated in sort of on a smaller scale in these classrooms throughout California and throughout the country. And I think that what is the most important part is how the failure to provide the kind of services that really address the needs of special education kids results in a situation where you have teachers and aides who are unable to handle the kids effectively or the way they should be, and we see these abusive situations occurring.
Thank you for that, Todd. I should probably preface this conversation with how I came to know these two gentlemen. Unfortunately, my son was a victim of abuse at a school here in Northern California, and then we retained them to represent us in action against the school district. And that's how I came to know these guys. Because the one thing about special needs children is that special needs children affects whether you're Republican or Democrat, rich or poor, black or white. It affects us all. I mean, there is no differentiation between that. It affects everybody across the United States, and in fact across the world. So unfortunately for people with kids with special needs, their business is booming because this is happening more and more often. You saw them recently on a show called The Doctors, where a kid was caged in there. It was locked in a cage, and that's just an atrocious thing that's going on. I'd like to sort of ask, and how I came to know those guys also is when a call came in from the police saying that my son was a victim of abuse. And that was my initial finding about it, and we'll talk a little bit more about my case a little bit later. So I wanted to ask the two attorneys, what is the definition of child abuse? What can a school or school district not do? Because I think they don't know, I think parents don't know. So if you guys could sort of clarify what a definition of child abuse is, that would be great.
Well, let me give you a broad definition.
Okay.
Broad definition would be the non-accidental, unjustifiable infliction of pain or mental suffering on a child. Now, there are certainly some situations where a school employee is entitled to restrain a child, but those circumstances are limited, they're circumscribed, and there are multiple reporting requirements when a school district employee actually starts laying their hands on a child to restrain them or seclude them.
Now, is that true in the California only, or is that nationwide, and that's a true statement?
Okay, well, it's not true nationwide because various states have their own laws that are applicable to their own school systems, and this actually varies fairly widely. So the definition I gave you and what can be done, and things that we discuss in general that relate to the law specifically are going to be referring to California penal law or the California Education Code.
Okay.
You know, Keith, I think that there's sort of two other things to kind of add to the mix, which, you know, these definitions sort of depend on the context. There's a definition of abuse for the purposes of a criminal action, and in our cases, in terms of what we're looking at is, has the teacher or aide used more force than was reasonably necessary under the circumstances? And usually, in a properly structured classroom, all of these things should be defined. In other words, there should be some prescribed course of action that identifies the antecedent behaviors which potentially would lead to the use of some kind of restraint or force, and there should be some protocol in effect to avoid getting to that point. The other thing that we're seeing is what we're calling a hostile educational environment, and that is that, you know, a truly toxic situation is one in which the teachers and aides are you know, hostile, are dislike kids because they're disabled. You know, they're angry at being in a situation where they're having to provide services to, I mean, people who love to do this work, love to work with special needs kids. This is what they want to do. But you have some folks who think this is a tremendous burden on them, and they make it very clear to the kids in the classroom that they're not liked, they're not wanted, and they're not valued because of their disability.
Wow, that's just amazing. And I can personally speak to the fact that I know that to be the case. These kind of teachers and aides really should not be out of the classroom, but there's so many protections for teachers. I know that's outside of the scope of today's discussion, but they really need to get and find another job. So thank you for that definition. Are you guys seeing more of an increase or decrease of child abuse claims across the United States, or instances? I mean, is it being just sensationalized, or are we actually seeing more of this?
You know, it's hard to know. It really is hard to know. Todd and I are seeing a lot of it, and we're seeing a lot of it across the country. But I'm not sure how one measures it. And I think we're seeing probably a decrease in areas where there's litigation over these matters, because once these school districts are held accountable financially, they tend to take action, and their insurance companies tend to require that they take action. And that action is usually training people so that they hope that that training will be effective and then result in these incidents occurring either not at all or less often.
Anything you would like to add to that, Todd?
Yeah, it's really hard to know precisely how, because it's not tracked in any kind of way that's where you can develop any kind of statistics on it. But we are certainly in our work just
you guys are very busy.
Stream.
You guys are very, very busy. I've seen
Yeah.
you everywhere, and you guys do tremendous work, and I'm glad that we're associated with you. I had a question that is interesting to me. Is there a pattern of a type of abuser that you've seen? Is it someone who's been teaching too long or not often enough? Is it usually the aide? Is it usually the teacher? What are you guys finding with that? Is there some kind of pattern, or is there just no pattern at all?
I don't think there's a pattern. We've seen teachers who've been teachers for many years that are abusers, and we've seen aides that have been aides for a very short time being abusers. I do not think that one can call out a type of person as an abuser.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add to that, Todd?
Yeah, I think that this is sort of anecdotal, but I mean I think that a number of our teachers, our perpetrators, are teachers who are burnt out, and are just sick of being a teacher, and unfortunately they end up in a classroom with kids who need a lot of individualized attention, and they're just bored with having to provide it. The one dynamic that you used to see in hospitals was, there would be a small core of employees who were just kind of got off on abusing people that they could get away with because they had people who were completely helpless and unable to report what was going on, and then around them was a whole cohort of people who, of course, basically were enablers who allowed that to happen. And I think that's what we're seeing on a small scale. You have somebody who is just absolutely toxic in this environment, and then you have administrators and other supervisors who just allow it to happen. Hopefully, I mean, the only reason that it comes to light is if there's another small group of people who finally get sick of seeing this happen and publicize it and bring it to light so that it can be addressed.
That's very true. I mean, you guys know the details on my particular circumstance, and instances of people knowing about it, and instances of the small group of people who finally spoke up. And we're going to talk about what a mandatory reporter is in just a bit. But are restraints allowed? That's a question that I know someone I've talked to in the past. Restraining a child, whether it's physically or with some kind of instrument, is that something that's allowed within California schools or nationwide, if you want to talk to that?
The answer is yes, depending upon the circumstance.
Wait, is this a lawyer answer? Yes.
Well, no, not really. Well, let me just tell you, there's actually a pretty strict definition of when you can, a school district can perform an emergency intervention where they are restraining a child, and that can occur in situations where the child poses an immediate danger to himself or others, or to property, and it has to be an unpredictable event. So otherwise there should be planning in advance to prevent this type of behavior from even occurring. But if it occurs and it's unpredictable and it's serious and it could cause significant harm, you can restrain a child in school, yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's take a question. If we could have a question from the audience. I know there's been a couple questions that have been raised relative to seclusion and what that definition is. You want to pull that one up if you can, Heather? What is the definition of seclusion just wondering, as my daughter was removed from a classroom for disruption 40 times in a 57-day period last year. She did not want to go into the classroom, and they restrained her to make her comply. How would you guys define that?
The definition of seclusion is, it depends on the context. And again, that's kind of lawyer speak, but generally for instance, in a hospital setting, and this is sort of where has been sort of developed more strenuously. The seclusion means involuntary confinement of a person alone in a room or an area from which the person is physically prevented from leaving. So that would be, the definition of what seclusion is. For in a hospital setting. Unfortunately, the state statute dealing with the school setting refers to a locked room. And so we're aware of a case in which a child was placed in a room, and then they physically placed like chairs or something up against the door to prevent the child from leaving. But the State Department of Education said, well, it's not a locked room because there wasn't a lock on the door. And so it's the rule about what seclusion is in a hospital setting is you're put someplace where you're physically prevented from leaving.
Interesting. Okay. Hopefully that addresses the question that Andy, but it seems like 40 times in 57 days is a little excessive. So I just know this is happening a lot. Can you give some examples of legal restraints? I mean, I know that in my particular case, they needed to be trained in a particular way. Is there things that they can do or shouldn't do? Can you give a description of what that would look like?
Well, there are some particular trainings for holding a child, restraining a child, that are designed not to injure the child. So anybody that is restraining a child should be trained in those techniques. And there's more than one. Okay.
But they should be trained is the key component. So you shouldn't have someone restraining someone who's not been properly trained.
Oh, of course. Otherwise, you may hurt the child.
And it should be clear. I mean, the parents should absolutely know.
That's what I was going to get
what to expect. I mean, there should be some very clear understanding of what would lead up to the restraint, and if there is a need for restraint, what it's going to look like, and what restrictions are there on it, and some assurance that the staff that's going to do it's been trained in doing it in a way that doesn't cause injury.
So tell me then, if they do restrain a child for the definition we talked about is okay, are they required to tell the parents that they did it, or we just never find out about it?
No, they are required to report it, it's much more than that. I mean, they're supposed to report immediately. If there has been a need for restraint that sort of goes beyond what was anticipated in the plan, then there should be a meeting to discuss, well, what's going on with our approach here? Is there a need for changing the plan so the idea is that the use of restraint should be the exception and not the rule.
Right. You would think that would be the case.
Right. And those reporting requirements, if there's an emergency intervention where there's a restraint applied, not only is the parent to be notified within 24 hours, a written record is to be sent to the school district so that they can track that.
Wow. To the school district and the county office, or just the school district?
Just the school district. There's supposed to be a written record kept of the circumstances requiring the restraint, what the restraint was, how long it took.
Wow. Are you finding that this is actually occurring, or are you seeing that's a step that's being missed?
we're finding that it's often missed.
I'm not laughing in that way. I'm not making light of it, but I'm not.
I think that there's definitely a correlation between a school not following these kinds of protocols and these kinds of reporting, and there being a problem. You know, I mean, I think that these problems start at the top, and the issue is the leadership in the district serious about enforcing these kinds of requirements and these kinds of protocols, and if they're not, then you know, if you've got a toxic classroom, the people there assume that they're okay in continuing their activities, and the people who are bothered by it assume that there's nothing that can be done, and so it continues, and they don't report it because they assume that the people at the top know what's going on and don't care.
Wow. I'm going to leave that comment alone because, you know, I have a lot of personal feelings about that kind of thing. But let's move on to a mandatory reporter. What exactly is a mandatory reporter? Who is a mandatory reporter, and what are they supposed to report? So I'll let whichever one or both of you guys address that question.
Well, a mandatory reporter is anybody who, through their employment, works with children. That's a mandatory reporter.
Okay.
You work with children, you are a mandatory reporter. And you are required to report any suspicion of a child having physical pain or mental suffering imposed on the child. That is what you are to report, a reasonable suspicion of that happening. And usually this is in the context, and people often think of it as the school is going to be reporting suspicions that a parent has abused a child. But in our practice, what we find is children are being abused in school, and the people who are mandatory reporters either are not trained to even know it. We've had cases where aides in a classroom had no idea they were mandatory reporters. So they were totally unaware that they were in California. They had a legal obligation to report that incident to the police. And, you know, I would say, in our experience, most school district employees don't really understand and appreciate that law. That it's not okay that they go to their principal and say, I saw a teacher hit a child. That is not complying with the mandatory reporting law. And I would say that that's still a real problem in California. That these employees are not taught that it is their responsibility to report to law enforcement, not to their coworkers, not to their supervisors, but to law enforcement. Because we've seen so many cases where you have aides that go to principals, and those principals don't do anything. They in essence conceal what's going on. And this goes back to the comment Todd was just making a few minutes ago. That this starts with a failure to follow regulations requiring reporting of incidents where children are restrained. So if you're not doing that, you are concealing school district behavior. And then it escalates often to situations where children are being abused. And even when reports are made to district employees, they don't do anything about it. And this then leaves these aides not knowing what to do. They don't really understand that they're supposed to go to the police, and they think they've reported to their principal and he hasn't done anything, and so they're really left in a pretty difficult position. So, you know, the need to train people as to their individual responsibility is a great need for that. And in California, just this year, they passed a bill requiring training. Mm-hmm. But there is no penalty attached to it if you do not train. The law says you have to train, but it doesn't penalize you not to train. But yeah, of course,
that's a toothless tiger.
Yeah.
You know, one thing that I would add to that is that the law is structured around the notion that you're mandated to report your suspicion. Okay, I mean, you're not supposed to figure out whether or not abuses occurred, that's for the police to determine. And so everything is built around the notion that you're protected if you report a suspicion of abuse that turns out not to be true. Okay? The idea is that we're going to bend over backwards to make certain that children are protected, and that if there's any reasonable suspicion, it goes to law enforcement investigates it. And unfortunately, the way it works in the school setting, it's just kind of backwards, that it doesn't get reported to police ever at all. And so that's why it is so why the school setting, where abuse is occurring in that setting by employees, that it really is something which really works against what the principles of protecting children.
So you said that they're supposed to report to the police, which makes sense, not to their principal, because the principal may or may not report that to the police. But when must they report? Is it something they can take a couple weeks to do? Is it something they have to report like right away? What does it talk about in terms of when they must report and how they must report? Is it written? Is it verbal? Is it both?
It's both. The report is to be made immediately, at least orally. Immediately, I think, means within 24 hours. And it is to be followed up in California on a designated form for reporting of suspected child abuse, which asks a number of questions relating to what they observed. Mm-hmm. And that has to be provided, I think, within 36 hours, if I recall correctly.
So, can they do it anonymously? I mean, if you're an aide and you're worried about your job, can they report anonymously, or do they have to say, hey, my name is Joe Jones and I saw this happening at this school?
Well, in our experience, aides often report anonymously. We have a number of cases where aides were afraid to come forward using their name because they thought they would be fired. And so what happens is the police gets a call or a letter that discloses what's been happening, but it's anonymous. And no, that doesn't comply with the law, by the way. Mm. The law requires a mandated reporter to say who they are and what they saw, because it makes it much easier for police to investigate, obviously.
Obviously.
Yes.
I see some other questions coming in here. Heather, do you want to grab some? I see some pertain to the topic we're talking about. All right. So the question that we have is, how do you feel about the Hughes bill law, bill law being repealed in California for AB 86, which now exempts CDE reporting of individual counties from reporting obligations of statistical instances of restraint used to the public state records database. Are you guys familiar with that law or that bill? And if not, then we'll just go to another question. I don't want you guys to answer something you're not comfortable answering.
Not that particular aspect of it. I mean, the Hughes bill remains in effect to the extent of restricting the ability of school employees to use restraints. It's the wording of it is a little unfortunate from looking at it from a lawyer's standpoint. And again, it uses the term locked room, which has created some problems that I described.
Okay. Why don't we take another question? Why is there no penalty to hold someone accountable?
Well, there is.
Okay, let's talk about that.
All right. So if you're a mandated reporter and you fail to report, the penalty is it's a misdemeanor to begin with, and you can get 6 months in jail or a $1,000 fine. So there actually is a significant penalty for failing to report. Unfortunately, let's talk about what Todd and I have experienced with the cases we've been handling here in California, particularly. There have been a number of cases we've handled where there's been prosecution of the immediate perpetrator who was laying their hands on the children. And with only one exception, in cases where we know that those events came to the attention of mandatory reporters who observed that happening and did not report, district attorneys have not filed charges against principals, against special ed chairs, and against superintendents of schools, even though they know that those mandatory reporters did not comply with the law. I don't know what it is that with these prosecutors, why they're not enforcing that law. Because if you do not prosecute the mandatory reporters who fail to report, the law has no teeth, the effect of the law is not achieved. The entire point is to get these other people to report if they learn that a child or suspect a child is being abused. So one of the things we really need to see, in our opinion, is for prosecution of principals, for example, who become aware of this type of behavior and don't report. And as soon as you see that happening in this state and it becomes publicized, you will see more reporting by those people. And until you see it, they can sort of lay back and think, well, nothing's really going to happen to me if I don't report.
You're muted, Todd.
Yeah, the additional, the additional piece to that is that unless there is this requirement on the employees to be reporting, then what kicks in is their self-preservation instincts to save their jobs, and so if they unless you impose an individual requirement on each employee to protect kids that's enforced, then this culture of kind of just containing the abuse is going to continue.
I see a question from Carolyn X of CPS claims. Can you pull that one up there, Heather? All right, let's see here. If CPS claims that they have no jurisdiction of abuse by school staff on school property, who does? And I think we know the answer to that, but why won't law enforcement cooperate in criminal prosecution of staff mishandling students with disabilities?
Well, let's talk about that. CPS only investigates custodial situations, so where the child is living. But the law enforcement agency that is supposed to investigate is generally the police force. Mm-hmm. And if there is a mandated report given to a police department, there is a mandatory duty on that police department to investigate that report. They cannot just put that piece of paper away in a drawer and say, "Oh, we're just too busy. We're not going to look at this one." Mm-hmm. So they themselves have the obligation to go and investigate.
So,
yeah, and Keith can add to that. There definitely is a part of the problem that's law enforcement, both police agencies and prosecution. They're to the extent there's a willingness to prosecute, it's the perpetrator, the person at the the low end of the totem pole. Whereas if they began to enforce the requirement of mandated reporting, against the principal, against the supervisor, the superintendent, then I think we begin to see some changes.
That's key. So it sounds like there's the mechanisms in place to protect our children, but the district attorneys are not taking the next step, which is to make some examples of some people to say, you need to now report. You can't hide this any longer, because we know that in my particular situation that a lot of people knew about it who were all mandatory reporters, and none of them reported. So if the district attorney would take action and make some examples, word would get out that, hey, you better start reporting these things because people are going to jail or being penalized financially for that.
That's correct. You're absolutely right.
So that's something we as parents and caregivers of our children should start talking to our legislators about and writing letters and letting people know that if you want to protect our kids, guys, the first line of defense is to get those district attorneys to start prosecuting people who are not doing the proper thing. Word will get out that it's no longer business as usual.
Yeah, you know, it would be kind of interesting to see how many teachers and aides have been arrested for abusing children in a school setting, because it doesn't usually occur in isolation. There are usually, in the special needs area, there are aides around. So when you compare the number arrested who were the perpetrator and the number arrested who were mandated reporters, frankly, I only know of one case where there was a prosecution. It was successful, by the way, in Northern California, where I believe it was the principal didn't report, and there was one prosecution. But that is the exception. And in all the other cases we've been involved in, there have been numerous mandated reporters that were aware of the incidents, and they never reported, and nothing happened to them criminally. They ended up in a lawsuit with us and the families, but they were not subjected to criminal penalties.
Interesting. That's very interesting to me. I see there is a couple more questions here. Do you want to pull up some of those, Heather? That's a good one. All right. It says, why are all state protection and advocacy restricted the powers of legal intervention on reported cases of abuse and neglect? Do you guys want to try to tackle that one?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah.
Why are all state protection and advocacies? Not either. Let me pull up another one, Heather. Can we pull up another one? I'm sorry, whoever, if you could clarify that question, that would be great. How were you able to discover the bad behavior was happening if the mandatory reporters are not coming forward? Let me answer that one in this case. We had a whole bunch of mandatory reporters who were reporting, but they were reporting to the principal. Eventually, it gotten so bad in my child's classroom that someone reported to the police. And it wasn't until the police got involved that they did their own investigation that we learned to the extent for which the failure of the mandatory reporting system had come to place. Those aides needed to have been trained that they should have first reported to the police, not to their principal. And I think that's where we need to really focus the energies on, is making sure our legislators focus the proper attention on getting all those first line of defense people trained on where they need to report, because that's what it needs to happen. We need to get better training at the school district, and the school site level. So that's how I found out about it in my case. Now, Peter or Todd, you guys want to add with that?
Well, we've had cases where other parents have observed teachers and aides abusing a child and made the report. They're often more educated in these subjects than the school employees. So that's one way. The other way we've talked about is the anonymous report from a school employee that has just gotten so fed up that they just can't stand it anymore, and they call the police or write a letter anonymously. And finally, there are cases where a child who is able to verbalize comes home and says what happened to them. And so those are the three typical scenarios where this information comes out.
Okay. Heather, I see a question from Angie Southern that starts with last March. Can you bring that one up? It says, last March, well, I see you there, Heather. Last March, I was informed, and everybody, Heather has been kind enough to join us as a technical contact, so she's staying behind the scenes, but she's my girl. Last March, I was informed of an abusive incident, physical and emotional, that happened to my daughter by my daughter's teacher. Another adult who works at the school reported it to me. I reported it to the principal. I was not aware that they were required to inform the police. That did not occur. I did file a Williams complaint at the district level, but I have not received a response from the district. If I contact the police, will they investigate?
they're required to investigate it. And I think that's what Peter mentioned earlier, that that really is what you have to do to follow through on these things in terms of getting some kind of accountability, is to go to the police when they receive a report from could be from the parent saying, I was told by an adult at the school that she observed abuse. The police department is required to investigate. If they don't investigate and that teacher goes on to abuse other children, they have civil liability for that. So that would be the step to take. I think that the parent in that situation should take matters into her own hands and go to the police.
Right. I think that's a good suggestion. Now, can you guys give me some examples? I'm sure we're all interested to know, why are people not reporting this? What is their reluctance for reporting? Any thoughts on that, guys?
I think it's kind of a combination of things. I mean, one is just a perception, and it's an incorrect perception by people who are really just not trained. And I'm talking now about supervisors who allow this kind of behavior to go on because they believe, well, this is what you have to do in order to control these difficult children. And you have, in many situations, aides who believe they're going to get fired. I mean, if the abuse is being perpetrated by a teacher, the teacher is in a much more powerful situation. The aide has no tenure, is not well paid, and is risking everything by reporting the teacher to the authorities.
Yeah, also, Keith, we have found a number of situations where you have an abusive teacher. She then enlists her aides to behave the same way she behaves with the children, so that they're complicit. And so they're all doing the same thing together, which also then causes them to not want to report on one another, especially when people start perhaps crossing a line for some of them, if that makes sense to you.
Yes, absolutely does, and that's a travesty. Now, you guys know in my particular case, we had some non-verbal kids. That makes it even worse. So people can get away with things a lot longer because the kids can't speak up for themselves. Let's see. Are there, and feel free if you don't feel comfortable answering this question, but I just have my own thoughts on it, but are there just too many protections for teachers? You talked briefly about tenure and all that kind of stuff. Does that protect a teacher from abuse? It shouldn't, but are there too many union protections for teachers that they can't be, and the districts are too reluctant to take action for those reasons? Any thoughts on that, guys?
I think it's an excuse for not doing your job. You know, we've certainly seen situations in which, for whatever reason, the administrators were aware of abuse, looked the other way. They could have investigated. They could have, you know, put the teacher on, you know, improvement plans. They could have removed the teacher from the classroom. And so I think that when schools are saying, or when principals are saying, "Oh, you know, the tenure rules prevent us from doing anything," that I think is just a case in which they're not doing their job.
I'll call it. It's just a bunch of crap. How's that? Okay. I'll say that. I had an idea. I'm not sure if this is legally practical or not, but I think if you put some teeth in that, so if people face criminal and financial liability, personal level, that principals and other people would be more likely to step forward, that if they knew that they could lose all that they personally owned because by not moving forward, then people would have spoke up a lot sooner in my son's case instead of 9 months later. They would have said something a lot sooner if they knew everything that they had was at risk. and I know that they can hide behind the district legal umbrella because they're district employees, but if we attach some financial or other kind of penalties for non-reporters, I think that would put some teeth in the situation. That's just Keith on my soapbox for now. Anything you would like to add to that, Peter?
No, I don't think so. I really, it would really be helpful if we had prosecution of
Right.
People who violate the mandatory reporting law. It would be really helpful in decreasing the amount of abuse in classrooms. I'm convinced of that.
And Keith, I definitely have talked to teachers in districts adjoining some of the districts that we've gotten settlements against, that they said, ooh, at our next in-service training there was a very lengthy training, and they were very clear about what our responsibilities were, making certain we understood what they were, because their insurance carriers are saying this is a major area of exposure, and we're going to make certain that there are rules in place that prevent it to the extent we can.
I think that's awesome. I think I sort of saved sort of the best for last, and I think that a lot of parents are definitely going to want to know what are some of the signs that your child might be being abused in the classroom in particular. Do you have any ideas relative to what kind of things we should be looking for?
Well, I think that one key is, your kids should be wanting to go to school. And if you see a change in that behavior where the child is all of a sudden not wanting to go to school, I mean, that's something that we hear over and over again. Children like hanging on to the doors of the car to prevent them from being taken to the classroom. Changes in behavior where they're becoming more aggressive. They're using language. They're using kind of angry language or swearing where they hadn't before. Naturally, if you're seeing cuts of, bruises, bruises on the arms where a child maybe has been grabbed, that's kind of a red flag. But I think changes in behavior really tell you a lot. And if you have a verbal child, and actually describing the teacher's mean, the teacher, that they're afraid of the teacher, these are things you need to start to explore. I mean, it's not to say that it's abuse in every case, but you need to know what's going on. And your child, if they're a special needs child, is going to be subject to abuse at a much greater rate than other children.
That's very true. Now, I can say, as being a parent of a child who's nonverbal, over the course of last year, my ex-wife and I, we noticed all those things. His behavior totally changed. He became super aggressive, pushing his little brother and sister down the stairs, wetting his bed where he'd been potty trained for 3 to 4 years, having accidents publicly where he's going bathroom out there, just not listening to me, not being defiant. All those things we saw, but we never put 2 and 2 together that something was going on at the school. In fact, we had sought outside help from people because it was such a problem for us, and we didn't know what it was. So I just want to encourage other parents who've got kids who are nonverbal. If your son or daughter changes that much, look deeper, dig deeper, talk to the aides. Another sign that we had was the teacher was very exclusive. She did not let the aides talk to us. She said that all the parents had to speak to her. So that's another sign. So if you see some secrecies going on, dig a little deeper. You have a right to talk to the aides. You have a right to call meetings. You have a right to call an IEP. You have a right to do all those things. If you start noticing a bunch of changed behaviors, dig deeper, because something could be going on. I'm not saying that it is, but something could. Peter, do you have anything you want to add with that?
Well, your point about secrecy is well taken, because we've seen in a number of these cases where the teacher doesn't allow parents to observe the class. And I'd be very concerned if I was a parent and I had a teacher who said, you cannot come in and observe my class, or if you do, we need advance notice when you're going to be there. That can be a red flag that there are problems in the classroom. So that I would look for that as well. And so, I mean, what Todd said and what you said are the keys. You see a sudden change in behavior, and it's not explainable to you as the parent. You better look to see what's happening at school.
Wow. You know, let's answer this question because it's something that's near and dear to my heart as well. But how do you feel about schools insisting on making a parent provide 24-hour advance notice to observe a classroom? Is that even legal? Is that we have a right to go anytime we want, or what? How does it work around that?
I don't know about the legal right, but I mean, I think that, you know, from talking to good teachers, you know, the best practice is that they should be encouraging parents to come into the classroom. And if they're being discouraged in any way, that's not right. There's something wrong there. I certainly would take that up. I mean, you should be able to go in the classroom at any time and observe what's going on. I mean, I don't, you know, just from the standpoint of making certain your child is getting the services and supports they need. I mean, if you're just going to the IEP and, you know, they're kind of giving you their, you know, explanation of what they're proposing that your child get, I think that you need to be in the classroom yourself from time to time to see what's going on, seeing whether or not you think it's working.
Well, let me ask you a question regarding that, Todd, and Peter, feel free to answer as well. So I have a parent that I've been talking to who says that the district told him and his wife that they can only visit the classroom once a month. They said it's too disruptive to the other children and to their child, and they only allow him to come in. And he's been fighting it for a long time. Obviously, that's not necessarily a sign of abuse, but as a parent, we don't really know what to do. I mean, when the district in their authoritative position says, you know, you can only come in once a month, parents sort of shirk away from that because they think, well, maybe that's what it is. But you're saying, as far as you know, there's no ability for them to say you can't come in. And you don't want to come in every day, but this child in particular was getting suspended all the time. So the parent wanted to come in to sort of talk about and see what was going on in the classroom that was causing this child to get suspended all the time and have these bad behaviors. You guys have any thoughts on that?
I just think that you have to take it up to the highest level. You know, I mean, if you have to go to a district meeting, I mean, to the school board, I think you need to do that. I mean, I think that's absolutely key that you be able to visit the classroom. And there's, I mean, the notion that that's disruptive. I just don't understand that.
Anything to add to that, Peter?
Well, if it's so disruptive without the parent being present, how is the parent being there going to make that situation worse?
That's a good one. I like that one. That'll shut them up right there. All right, let's see. What can us parents do to protect our kids? I mean, putting a camera in these classrooms. I know people have talked about that. I know some parents are putting hidden cameras on their children themselves to keep track of that. I mean, us parents are sitting out here pulling, I mean, I don't have any hair, but if I had any hair, I'd be pulling it out right now, wondering how I can protect my kid when he can't talk. You guys have any suggestions or thoughts on what parents can do to protect our children?
Well,
other than hiring you guys after things happen.
Well, you don't want to be in a situation where you're hiring us.
Right.
You know, you want to be involved in understanding what's going on before it's necessary to come to us. I think that the best thing to do is just to be very active involved with your kids' education, and of course that's it's hard when you're working, but I think involvement's the most important thing.
I agree with that. Anything to add to that, Peter?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, you're on the phone?
Oh. Let's see. Heather, do we have any other questions that came in? Let's see. Here's another question. If a student reports abuse, can the law district claim the student's disability is detrimental to competency in reporting via self-advocacy? Oh, I think that's a good question. If a student reports abuse and he has a disability, can the district say we can ignore him because he's not competent to make that?
No,
We
they can't.
definitely can't ignore. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I was going to say, of course they can't ignore him. If he reports abuse and there's a reasonable suspicion that he's been abused, there needs to be a mandatory report made.
I think that's the answer. I think the takeaway that I'm getting here, if I had to summarize as it relates to the mandatory reporter, is toss it to the police. If you suspect, the school suspects, if anyone suspects, if you see something that's suspicious, toss it to the police and then let them investigate it and see what the truth is. I think that's sort of what we're hearing right here, Peter and Todd. Are you guys agreeing with that?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. All right, let's see here. Is there a statute of limitations in terms of, I'll get to that one second in just a second, Angie. Is there a statute of limitations for bringing a case against a school district or whatever? So if you suspect that something happened last year, is it too late, or what is that? How does it work for that?
Well, there's different statutes of limitations depending whether you're in state court or federal court.
Okay.
So for state actions, there's a claim filing requirement. Before you can bring a lawsuit against a public entity in state court, you have to file a claim, and the claim statute says within 6 months. However, when it's a minor that is involved, they actually have up until a year to file, and then they file a late claim. And that time period generally runs from when the parent discovers the abuse, especially in situations where a child can't communicate what's happening to them. Mm-hmm. For federal court actions that are based on federal law, there's no claim filing requirement. And so the statute of limitations is 2 years from your 18th birthday for those kind of federal civil rights cases.
Okay. I see a question came in here. Let me see what it is. What is considered an improper restraint? You want to address, I know we sort of talked about it earlier, but if you don't mind covering it again, gentlemen, that'd be great.
Well, that's basically a situation in which you've used a restraint where there isn't an immediate need to intervene to prevent serious physical injury to the child or to other people. And so if you don't have that circumstance when the restraint is applied, it's improper.
Right. Here's a question from Angie Sutherland as well. Is how can we get parents to join forces in changing laws in our state and nation? And I'm going to go ahead and answer that one. That's not an attorney question. It's more of an advocacy question. It's by us parents doing what we're doing here, sharing information, sharing resources, and banding together. Because even though I might be black and you might be white, or you might be rich and I might be poor, we all have a children with special needs. And if it's not us, who's it going to be? So we need to join forces, become informed, be active, be proactive in our child, talk to our legislators about what's important to us. The biggest lobby that you have out there that no one ever touches is the elderly lobby, because those guys vote. They vote as a bloc, and legislators know it. So if we can be more proactive in our collective community, then I think we can have more of a voice, and we can change laws. We can make the mandatory reporter law have some teeth. We can have that kind of impact and protect our children. So that's Keith again on the soapbox, but it's such an important topic that we need to be proactive. So part of what we do on this website is just to help educate people about various topics that are of interest to us as a community. So thank you for that, Angie. I appreciate that. Let's see, I might have a couple more questions for you, then we're going to be wrapping up. We're approaching the hour. So I would like each of you guys to sort of tell us how someone might be able to contact you if they want to reach you or talk to you about their particular case. So Todd, why don't you go ahead and start first? How do they reach you?
My web, I don't know whether I seem to have lost my identifier down at the bottom. My website is Boleylaw, BOLEYLAW.com. That's probably the best place to get my contact information. We have a form there if you feel that you have or you want to speak to us about some suspected abuse. There's a form to fill out, and Peter and I work together on these cases. So if you contact me, it's like talking to Peter and vice versa.
Okay, and Peter, you?
Yep, our website is Hinton Alfert, HintonAlfert.com. So we have a form that can be filled out there also, and you can see who we are.
Okay, great. I see one more question just came in, and we're going to make sure we attach everyone's links to their contact information on this show notes here that you see on the notes. But one last question here from Carolyn X. What do you think? Let me see here. Obviously, this whole topic of restraints is a big deal for us parents. I know that my son was restrained on a bus with these things that held him in place and locked him to a bus last year, and I didn't like that. So restraints are a big deal for us. So what do you think of the use of restraint harnesses on students? Example, a wraparound blanket with straps that ties down the student's torso. Is this not a premeditated use of restraint?
Well, it's clearly a restraint,
Right.
and my concern about something like that is the potential for injury,
Right.
potential for it to be abuse. I mean, it's just the thing that you want to avoid is the situation where this becomes a routine thing that's done.
Where they just lock you
I'm very
down.
concerned about it.
It is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's abuse, but it's something you should definitely look at.
Yeah, I think that you would really want a plan that makes certain that is the absolute last resort,
Okay.
and is used only when there is a really significant threat of serious injury.
All right, gentlemen. My last question is to both of you. Is there some question that I should have asked you that I did not ask you? Something that I should have covered that you'd like to wrap up with in your final comments here?
No, not for me. I think you've done a very good job of illuminating some of the problems that are occurring in our special ed classes, and with respect to school districts' failures to adhere to the administrative rules that apply to their special ed children, and also their failure to comply with the penal code with respect to their mandatory reporting requirements.
Okay, excellent. And you, Todd?
No, I just want to thank you, Keith, for having put this together and taking on this responsibility of informing other parents about these issues, because that's parents talking to each other is really going to be the only way that these problems get solved.
No, I appreciate that, gentlemen. I appreciate you guys taking the time to chat with us about it. It is an important topic. One last thing I'd like to say is on January 8th, 2015, I'm going to have another show with Ryan Platt, if you guys know who he is. He does special needs planning. The topic is on the ABLE Act, which is everyone's saying it's supposed to be a good act, but we'll wait and see what his thoughts are on that. So look for us January 8th, 2015. I'll send out information relative to that show. I want to thank you guys all for being on the show with us, and I will send you the information. If there's any other questions that pop up after the show, I'll let you guys know. We can comment and do that here, and I'll send you guys the link here. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time, and you guys just hold on for just 2 seconds. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.